Welcome. We are in the middle of a series of 6 sessions in which we're asking questions about primarily the institutional church. And some of these are questions we might not want to have to address, but they're questions that we do and realities that we do have to face. And the good news is that when we can face the realities, we are able to come along and move ahead with whatever future God has for us. So, last time we talked about the reality of the collapse of the church culture and a little bit about what that means. And we asked, what is the question that is the wrong question? The wrong question is, how do we do church better? The tough question is, how do we deconvert from churchianity and experience more of what actually Christianity as a movement is all about? This time, today, we're going to be talking about another reality and a couple of other questions. The reality is this, and I hope that this is not news to you. I've been trying to share this for nearly the entire 4 years that I've been here. How do we shift from thinking in terms of church growth to thinking in terms of kingdom growth? Basically, this is what has happened. As the church culture has collapsed, churches have felt the greater burden for church growth. So churches, they see that there's emptiness in the sanctuary and say, how can we fill those empty pews? How can we fill these empty classrooms? How can we get more people interested in the programs they used to be interested in? How can we sustain our budget like it used to be sustained? And so we find ourselves, pouring tons of energy and effort into those kinds of things, and they become the focus of what we are all about. And so in today's conversation, just going to try to see if we can reshape that a little bit. If our focus is on church growth, and for many years it was, for several decades, all of the literature, all of the books, all the conferences, all the seminars were church growth, church growth, church growth, church growth. A lot of those seminars I've been to, about every one of those books I probably have either read or I know about. It was a constant barrage of your church needs to grow. And the burden that churches felt as they kept hearing the message that you got to find ways to do church growth. And the whole conversation kind of centered around, how do you get more members? How do you increase the budget? How do you offer more programs? How do you build more facilities? And once your world revolves around those things, they become your entire world. And that's what has happened in the institutional church. Those 3 or 4 things have become the entire world of the institutional church. And it's difficult to be liberated from that, to, in a sense, just rediscover what is this thing of Christianity as a movement in our world or in our community look like. Somebody made this observation. It's pretty good. We have the best churches that men can ever build, but we are still waiting for the church that only God can get credit for. And that's a pretty good summation of what has happened in the institutionalized church. So the wrong question is this: how do we grow the church? That sounds like it would be the right question. It sounds like it would be the one thing that everybody should be rallying around. However, that only makes sense if the only vision or the only perspective that we have of church is that of an institution. If the church is primarily institutional, then that is the question that we do ask. How do we grow it? How do we get more people? How do we attract them? Which all in itself became a model of church known as the attractional model. And as churches had to start thinking about how do we attract people, then they started having to adopt business models and strategies and all kinds of things to get people in the door. Once they got them in the door, to keep them there, and to provide all kinds of religious goods and services that would meet their need. And the attractional church, for a good number of years, became the primary model of how we did church. So we are really putting that particular model out in front of us and saying, is that really what Jesus had in mind? Is that really a New Testament vision of what the church should look like? And we're questioning that and looking at this from a different perspective. So the question of how do we grow the church is the question that's been the prevailing question, but the one now that I'm challenging us to bring into question itself. When we think about growing the church or the institution of the church, this is typically what happens. People become customers, and we begin to offer religious goods and services. And in our culture, particularly, as you well know, in our Western culture, we are already consumers. We do more consuming than any other group of people. And we bring that same kind of mentality to church. And so in the Western world particularly, the church has really had to guard against caving into the temptation of providing all of the things that would meet the needs or meet the appetite of a consumer. And many people go to churches and they'll consume what the church has to offer, and once they've consumed, and then they look across the pasture, the highway, they see another church and they'll move over there and they'll consume more, and once they've consumed all of that, they'll pick up their tents and move somewhere else. This is why there's so much movement among churches, because we have so many people who are connected with churches who live out of a consumeristic mentality. And that's just who we are, and for many people in our culture, that's the only kind of life that they know. So we have typically, churches have kind of caved in to being customer oriented. We've kind of caved in to the needs of the consumer. We've surrounded ourselves with a whole bunch of different methodologies and hoping that one of these particular methods of doing church would work. And we have bought into the false hope that we've done this part or we've had this program. What's the next fastest, best, slickest, greatest program that's about to be unfurled on the world? And once it comes, we'll dive in deep into that and we'll do the next best, greatest thing. And we've bought into that, thinking that just around the corner is the answer to everything, and somebody's just about ready to unleash on us the thing that's going to, change everything forever, and we'll invest in it. But here's the tough question. Here's the question we really need to be asking. It's not how do we grow the church. The question is, how do we be the church outside of the institution? Most of us are very comfortable with being the church within the institution. We know what programs are offered. We know where things are. We know, what to do. We know when to show up. We know what to expect. And we have, in great part, become very, very comfortable with an institutional vision of church because we know it so well. And so it's now in our comfort zone, and it's in our wheelhouse, and we can manage it and we know what to do about it and all of those kind of things. The tough question is not how can we do things better within the institution, but how can we just be the church outside of the institution? And for many of us, that's probably a whole new way of thinking about the church. And it's the same kind of thing that Jesus bumped into when he encountered the Pharisees. And they knew how to do institutionalized church, institutionalized temple, institutionalized religion. But they were, for the greater part, they were doctrinally driven, and they had a great sense of judgmentalism about them. The same kinds of things, by the way, that many people have about the church in our Western culture. They just see us as a group of people who just check off, do you believe this? Do you believe this? Do you believe this? And we just become doctrinally airtight. And then they also see us as a people who are very judgmental against everything that they are for. And so in many ways, we have become a modern version of the Pharisees. I don't like holding up the mirror and seeing that in myself, but I have to realize that there is the reality that when I look in the mirror, I could easily be a Pharisee of today's world, and I certainly don't want to be, and I don't think you want to be. So how do we think about and talk about being the church outside of the institutional framework of the church? And I'll just mention several ideas. None of these cost anybody any money. They're all very basic, but they are ways that we can reframe the conversation, and I'm confident ways that will allow us to come to some fresh ways and just seeing what God is doing in our world and how we can partner with God on that and be part of His redemptive mission. So, first, just being able to serve the world in which we live. I know this is nothing new, but when I look at myself and oftentimes when I'm just kind of gazing across the institutional church, this is what typically happens. We are a kind of service-oriented people. Most people are. They do legitimately and with great care want to serve people. Oftentimes what happens is we end up serving ourselves. We end up serving each other, which is great. We end up serving those who are within the institution. But what about extending that desire that we have and that calling that we have to service and starting to figure out how do we serve the world? That means that we have to take a posture of humility. You can't, nobody can be a servant. I mean, the prevailing model of Jesus is servant. Nobody can be a servant while we're being arrogant, even if we're being religiously arrogant, even if we're being arrogant about our morality or our doctrinal beliefs, the things I just mentioned in connection with the Pharisees. Service to the world requires a great deal of humility because we would be serving people who don't look like us, who don't have the same views that we might have, who have very culturally different perspectives than we might have, who might have different values than we might have, different behaviors than we might have. And when you expand the idea of service to serving the world in the name of Jesus, that becomes a far different thing than just serving the institutional church, which we know so well, and we know the people in it. And so one of the ways that we learn how to be church outside of the institution is by serving the world in which we live, serving it with a deep sense of humility. And it is in that people see what the love of God is like, and they see that God is present, and they see, they'll begin to see why the story of God is what it is, why it's just so central that Jesus died on a cross for us, and what it means that he was risen from the third day, and the Holy Spirit has been sent, all of those kinds of things. So first, we can continue to just open ourselves to hearing God speak to us about ways that we can serve the world rather than just simply judge the world. It's easy to judge, isn't it? Easy for me. A second way is we can figure out what is it going to take for us to live in a relationship with the world. We're pretty good at living within the relationship of each other, or with each other in relationship in the context of church or institution. But the real test is, how do we live in relationship with the world that God so deeply loves? And sometimes in our evangelism, we miss this slightly. I grew up in a world in which evangelism kind of consisted of just going out, you see somebody, and you start a conversation, and you open up a track, or you ask them a couple of questions about their salvation or relationship to God. And I did that hundreds of times, and what I realized in that was that I felt like I was doing what God wanted me to do just by a cold meet of somebody on the street, or a cold presentation. But what I was missing was the relationship. And then I started looking back at the life of Jesus. He really focused on helping people have relationships, and it's in the context of being willing to invest in relationships that are outside of ourselves, outside of the institutionalized church. It is along the lines of those relationships over time that people begin to see and hear the gospel. It becomes real to them. It's not just a presentation. It's not just a sales pitch. People have heard enough of all of that. It's not a God info commercial. It's about life and transformation. And the way that in more cases, far more than not, God's Spirit works in us is through the relationships that we cultivate with people. And it is not easy for people who are so used to and so familiar with the institution of church to put themselves out and develop relationships with the world. And so, we'll have conversations about that and ways that we can all do that better, so that the gospel is not just a drive-by shooting, which a lot of people have phrased it as, when we just go out and we just present, and then we try to call for a decision, and then we move on. I know in some cases, God does work in that, and there are some people who have the gift of evangelism, but the kingdom really works when people are developing relationships. And one of the biggest challenges for churches is, how do we develop relationships outside of the institution where we might not be so comfortable? A third thing, and all of this kind of rolls together, is starting with the message of God's love rather than starting with the message of if you're a sinner and you're going to die and go to hell unless you say this prayer and sign the dotted line. I know all of that sounds very spiritual to go about it that way and to drive for a commitment and so forth. It's just interesting that Jesus didn't use that approach. He didn't try to win the world by inducing a particular fear of an eternity without him, he won the world by overwhelming it with love. The cross is not a statement of hatred, it's a statement of divine love. And as we serve people, as we figure out how to better relate to people who are not part of who we are, as we start loving people and sharing with them the news that is a good news, that God has died for them, that Christ wishes to redeem them, that they can be transformed by the Spirit, then we're going to be seeing some of those transformation of lives and celebrating what God is doing with that. And then finally is having a kingdom perspective about life rather than a church perspective. And this is really just a culmination of all the things I have mentioned today. There's a difference between a church worldview and a kingdom worldview. And many of us have good perspective on what the church is all about, but the church worldview is what has kind of fashioned our entire worldview. Our worldview should be a kingdom vision, and how the church relates to the kingdom, and how the church serves the kingdom, and how the church magnifies the kingdom. But it's a liberating thing to move from an institutionalized church vision of the world to a kingdom vision of the world, and we begin to see the world differently. And we even, because we're stepping away a little bit from the institution and all the things that we're so familiar with, it's really refreshing and renewing and energizing to step back and see the broader context of what God is doing in our world and his mission, and how he wants us and calling us and desires us just to partner with him in that mission, rather than just becoming minutely focused on the institutional church. So I hope this inspires and challenges and encourages you in some way, and these are conversations we'll look forward to having when we are together. But thank you for sharing a few minutes with us, and I look forward to when we'll be able to sit across from each other and talk about how do we connect with our world and let the world see the love of Christ in us. Have a great day. We'll see you next time.